Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing the new clubs for April 2025. So we have the wax seal of the month, which is called Petal Postage. And with that is the Blue Smoke wax beads. Then we have our clear stamp of the month, which is called Scent and Seal stamp. So it's got a little bit of a background stamp. It's a small background, but you could stamp it a couple times to create a full background, and then several sentiments to go with it. We have our Stencil of the month called Airmail. So the whole collection, all of the clubs this month revolve around letters, postage, that sort of thing. So that was the large die of the month there. It's called Lock and Key Mailbox. And then we have the BetterPress of the month called Postage Edge Extension or Expression, sorry. And I love how there's a bunch of different things that go with that BetterPress of the month. The stitching die of the month is called Stitched Taking Notes, and it's a very simple one. It's a perfect one if you're new to stitching dies. Then we have the die of the month, which is called Snail Mail Post, and I'm using that one a lot in this video. The 3D embossing folder is called Postage Magic, and I just love this for a background, but I'm going to be cutting it up. Then we have an embossing folder of the month called Perforated Stamp Edges. Very, very simple, but I think it creates a really nice texture for the background. The glimmer of the month is called Scattered Letters, and then there is black glimmer foil to go with that. And then the caboodle for the month goes with that glimmer of the month, and it's called Scattered Letters. It's a stencil set to color in each one of those letters. So in this video, normally I break up my club videos into a couple. This time I have it all in one. I'm going to create 6 different cards combining the different clubs and just creating with them. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is the glimmer of the month. I have my glimmer machine heated up here. I'm going to take that black foil and I'm going to cut a couple pieces, one for a background, one for the sentiments. So there is 2 different sentiments that come with that glimmer of the month. So I'm going to foil them at the same time. And I'm also going to do my solid hot foiling at the same time. Regularly when I do my foiling, I make sure to do solid hot foiling. It's much easier to store the solid hot foil pieces if I don't intend to use them right away than it is just to store that extra foil. And it really only takes a few minutes. So I have my glimmer machine hot, put that glimmer of the month on there, put my black foil with the pretty side facing the plate, and then my Hammermill cardstock, stacked it up, pressed the timer button, and once that stopped blinking, I put it through my Platinum 6 machine. So once that background is done, I can glimmer my sentiments here. Now, full disclosure, one of the sentiments, the one on the bottom, I got some overfoiling on it. So I will fix that. I will still use it. It's definitely not a perfect foiling. The top one was totally fine, but that bottom one, not a perfect foiling at all. So with those 2 things already done and ready, I'm ready to do my solid hot foiling. So I put that solid hot foil plate on my glimmer machine, let that heat up for a few moments, then layered it all together. Once that timer button had gone off, put it through my Platinum 6 machine. So not only can you foil or solid hot foil the backgrounds, you can also do the sentiments. And I love having both regular foiled and solid hot foiled sentiments because sometimes the solid ones just work better for a design than the regular ones. There are different things that you can do with each one of them. For this video, I'm actually using all of the sentiments that I create. Don't always do that. Sometimes I'll have leftovers or extras left over, but this time I actually use them all. So with my solid or with my backgrounds done, I'm just going to die cut my sentiments. That comes with, the glimmer of the month comes with a die to cut out those sentiments, and I do tape them in place with some Best Ever craft tape in order to make sure that that die is not going to move and shift on me. And after die cutting the solid one, I die cut to the other one, so they're all ready to go. Now, the bottom one, because it didn't foil perfectly, the solid hot foiling is definitely not going to be able to be used. So the way that I use that one instead is I just use it to glue behind this one here and make sure that it has a little bit more substance to it. It makes it a little bit thicker. In order to fix the overfoiling, I'm using a Tombow sand eraser. So it's just removing that extra foil that's on that cardstock. Now, there is a little bit, because this is black foil on white cardstock, there's a little bit of residue left. So in order to cover that and still make this usable, what I end up doing is taking some Distress ink and I ink blend on the background and it covers up those marks. Now, I chose Chip Sapphire Distress ink, which is fairly dark. You can still, in real life, you can see it a lot better than you can see it on camera. On camera, it looks really, really dark, but in real life, you can see the sentiment a little bit more. But what it does is it covers those marks on the back of it. Another option would have been to use, say, a red here, but I think, and that's mainly because I'm using red in several of the cards, but I think the red, you might have seen the marks a little bit more than you can with the blue. I think the blue hides it really, really well. So what I'm not showing on this video is Spellbinders, and I'm going to show it in my next several videos. Spellbinders has a new product coming out this month called DIY Color Deck, and it is a collection of 52 color cards, art cards, that you can create your own color combinations using the inspiration from those art cards. So I'll be sharing that more in my next several videos. I plan on using it a lot. It's a great way to get out of a color rut. So my color combination that I'm using here, it's mostly primary colors with a little bit of secondary colors in there, and it's inspired from one of the cards from the color deck. And when I share the video for that color deck, you'll see these cards with the color that, or the deck card that inspired them, in case you're wondering where the color combination comes from. It started off with the blue smoke wax pearls or wax beads, and then because this is postage theme, it just seemed right to pair red with it, and then the color combination as well as that card, it just inspired the whole thing. So I started off with that foiled background, and I'm using the Caboodle stencil that coordinates with it, and I'm doing some ink blending. So the first color that I ink blended there was that Chip Sapphire, and I'm not trying to go super heavy with my ink blending. I'm trying to make sure that I'm a little bit heavier around the outsides of each letter and a little bit softer towards the inside, so it has a little bit of color variety to it. The red that I'm using is Candied Apple. And then the yellow or cream that I'm using is Scattered Straw. So it's a really nice pale yellow. Now, anytime I use my ink blending brushes, especially if I haven't used them in a while, I always have some scrap paper to the side to make sure to clean off my brushes to try to get any of that excess ink off. Especially if I'm using a lighter color like this, I want to make sure that I have I'm ink blending the color that I actually want and not some leftover ink from a previous project. So this Caboodle item, I think there's 4 different stencil layers to it. They're very easy to line up with the foiled lines, and that foil is going to resist that ink, so you don't have to, even if you use a light colored foil and you want to make sure there's no ink left on it, you just use a clean piece of paper towel and just wipe it lightly after you're done, and it removes any ink that might be on top of that foiled edge or that foiled surface. The last color I'm using here is Weathered Wood, and this is the first ink color that I chose because I thought it was closest to those blue smoke wax beads. Once again, I'm making sure to be a little bit heavier around the outsides of each one of those letters and then a little bit lighter towards the inside. I just think it looks a little bit more interesting. If you want just a solid color, you can absolutely do a solid color when you're doing your stenciling. It's really personal preference, and I love the fact that with stencils, you can pick it and choose how solid, how light, how heavy you want each one of those sections to be to create the look that you're going for. So with my background done, I'm ready to trim it down. So I'm going to trim my piece here down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then I'm going to create a mat for this, and I'm going to trim that to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. I'm using my guillotine trimmer here. I love using this for the smaller pieces of cardstock. It's just very convenient, easy to have on my desk or right to the side of my desk and ready to use. I'm gluing everything together with Barely Art craft glue, and I have it in a fine line bottle. So this works perfectly for adding larger layers to my cards, but it also works when I'm putting smaller die cuts together, and you'll see that later on in the video. And then while I'm gluing things, I always have an acrylic block nearby, and I just put it on the piece that I'm doing. It holds everything down nice and flat and frees up my hands to create or to work on something else while something is drying. So that stencil or that card design for my first card there, super, super simple. Now, when I'm doing solid hot foiling, sometimes I'll use them in my cards. Sometimes I will use them to do die cutting. It really depends on the look of the solid hot foiled piece. This particular one, I thought it looked really, really interesting, having all of those letters black with the light outline. So I'm going to use that as a background. I have the tulips die cut from the die of the month. That die of the month has those tulips, it has the mailbox, and it has the snail, and you could use them all together on one card. I separate them and use them on 3 different cards because I just thought they were, each one of those elements were unique and interesting on its own. So I have my tulips here die cut out of some Spellbinders cardstock. I'm using beeswax, that's the yellow color. I'm using alabaster, which is the pale cream color. The red is poppy. And then I also have some fern cardstock here for those leaves. With the rest of the cards that I'm creating, I'm also using some indigo as well as celestial. For this particular card, I want to use the wax seal of the month and create some wax seals. So anytime I'm creating wax seals, I typically will do a few of them at a time and have them ready to go so that when I'm creating the card, I have all of my pieces ready to go. I have the wax starter kit here that has that silicone mat, the little wax burner, as well as the little thing with the handle that you melt the wax in. I lit my tea light up and I'm melting that wax. I have these little wax storage boxes that I store the wax seals in, as well as my extra handles. They come in very handy, and there's little dividers between each of those sections, so you can customize how big or how small those sections are. When I'm melting my wax, I have a little toothpick here that I use to stir it around just to make sure that all of those beads are melted. And then I also like to use my craft spoons to make sure that I get as much of that wax out of that scoop as possible so I'm not wasting it. The other great thing, because it's a silicone scoop or a silicone spatula, when that wax cools on there, I can just pick it off and I can put it back into the container or the plastic bag it comes in. Those pieces can be re-melted. They can be mixed with other colors really easily. So there's not a lot of waste when it comes to those wax seals. So with my first one done here, I'm going to use my detail scissors and I'm just going to trim around the edges. Because this is a rectangle shape, I didn't really like the edges of the wax the way it creates it when you're using it. So I wanted to use my detail scissors and make sure to have a little bit more of a precise seal to it. So I tuck that one to the side. All of those excess pieces go right into that scoop to melt to work on my next wax seal. And I'm only going to create 2 of them for this video, but obviously can create extras and have extras ready to go. And I'm using the blue smoke wax beads. Obviously we could use any color we wanted here. I really love the look. It's almost like a steel blue. It has the like a little bit of a gray property to it, and it also has a bit of a metallic shine to it, so it's got a really pretty finish to it. So here's my second wax seal. Once again, I'm going to grab those detail scissors, cut those excess bits off the side. If you like those excess parts there, you could absolutely leave them on there. It just didn't go with the look that I was wanting for the cards that I was going to be creating. So these extra pieces that were trimmed off, I'm just going to put it right into that Ziploc bag. And I do have a container that I got from a local dollar store that I use to store my wax beads. I haven't put these particular ones in there yet, but it does come in handy, that especially for the variegated ones, and I can pick and choose which colors I'm wanting to use. So with my solid hot foiled background there, I could have used it as it was and left the lines white, but I thought it would look a little bit more interesting to have them colored. So I used the weathered wood distress ink and just did some light ink blending on there to create that kind of light blue or that steely gray blue on there. I have my mat here that I'm trimming to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and then my solid hot foiled piece is going to be trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So the same sizes as my last card. With these pieces all trimmed, I'm ready to glue them to the base of my card, and I'm just using some classic white cardstock to create those bases. I like to use the Spellbinders cardstock because it's got a nice weight to it, and they make perfect card bases as well as they're perfect for die cutting. So with my tulips here, and I did a little bit of ink blending with those distress inks on my sticky mat just to give them a little bit of color variation. I've let that ink dry while doing the rest here, and I'm ready to layer those pieces together. And they're very, very easy to layer together. One of the layers is just that full tulip, and one has the petals from the front of the flower. The other thing I want to do is take my sentiment here. I could have left it white, but because I ink blended the blue on that background, I wanted to change the color of the sentiment a little bit. I thought the red would make it pop a little bit more, and it coordinates with one of the flowers as well. Obviously, it could have been ink blended to whatever color you want it to be. Another option would be to do the solid hot foiling on color cardstock. I typically will do it just on white Hammermill though, mainly because while I'm creating, the odd time I change my mind on what colors I want to use, and by having it on white, I can pick and choose, and for future projects, if I have any excess sentiments left over, it just gives me a lot more options. Again, I'm using the Barely Art glue to glue my tulips down here. I have 3 tulips and I created them with different colors on purpose just because I wanted a variety of colors here. You could definitely use all of the same colors if you want, but I do think that ink blending just adds a little bit of visual dimension, a little bit more interest to it. As I'm gluing them down, I'll put my stem down first, then put the top of the flower itself, and then I will typically use those leaves and just kind of fill in different areas. For this card, this is where I wanted to use one of those wax seals. I typically like those wax seals kind of at the base or the stems of flowers. I'm not really sure why, I just like the look of it. And then thought I would tuck in one of the ends of my sentiment so that that kind of just made a base for those flowers to be sitting on there. And I really love that white, that bright red sentiment on that black background. It definitely pops on there. And then that wax seal coordinates the blue ink that is on the lines of those letters on the background, as well as the mat that's around it. For my third card here, I'm going to be using that stitching die for the background of my card, but I'm also going to be using the Mailbox from the die of the month. Again, I just thought it was really interesting to have a die that had 3 elements that could easily be used on their own. For the floss, I have a container kit of the popular colors. This is some DMC floss here. They come with 36 different colors there, and I thought it would be a great place to start, especially with the popular colors, because you have a good variety of the different colors there. I'm using 2 of them. I'm using number 817 red and number 827 light blue. I'm going to be using the light blue to do the lines on my little paper here. Now with that the stitching die, there is an outside die and then there's the inside stitching part. So if you didn't want to do this stitching, you could just die cut the outside piece. Another option would be to leave this inside piece here, but just not do the stitching. It does create some indents in there, so you do have lines if you wanted to, say, write a personal note on there, or if you had a sentiment stamp that you wanted to stamp on there, you could do that as well. You can see that these stitching lines here are very, very easy. The holes for them are on either end of the paper, so there's not a whole lot of stitching in between, and it does get done really, really quick and easily. When you have these DMC flosses, there are 6 strands in there, and for each one of these, I use 2 of those strands. For me, that's the right thickness. If you want it thinner, you could only use 1 strand if you choose, and if you wanted a little bit thicker, you could use more. So you really have the option of making it personal and using as much or as little as you would like. When I'm doing stitching dies, I will use some Best Ever Craft tape and tape the end of my floss to my background or to the back of the cardstock. And I do that when I'm starting and I do that when I'm finishing. So it just secures everything in place. For this particular one here, I could have made my floss longer so that it would, say, do the entire piece, but that's a whole lot of floss there. So I did it a little bit shorter. I ended up being able to do 4 or 5 lines with each one of those pieces of floss. So I will be changing, or I do change the floss in my needle fairly often, mainly because each one of these areas is quite long for stitching. But you can see how quick and easy it comes together and creates a unique background for the card. Another option would be to use this die and ink the die before die cutting it if you, say, wanted to have ink on those lines but not necessarily want to stitch them. So you do have a few different options here. I made my floss just slightly too small and I didn't have quite enough to get that last line of writing in there, so I have to make I have to cut just another little teeny tiny piece of floss here for one line, which I thought was kind of funny. I find it very hard to estimate how much floss is going to be needed. especially if you're doing something that has a little bit of length to it. I always struggle with not wanting to make that floss too long so that it would not entangle up on me, and not wanting to make it too short. And here I made it just a touch too short, but that's totally okay. Now, when I'm doing stitching, I will often cut an extra piece and seal in those floss pieces on the back. For this particular one, I didn't do that because it's going to be glued to the base of the card, but you could easily do that if you wanted to add a little bit of extra thickness. If you wanted to seal those pieces of floss in there, or the ends of the floss in there, you could easily do that. For this, because there's not a whole lot of dimension, because there's not a whole lot of those floss pieces on the back of it, I didn't really find it totally necessary. So with the blue pieces done horizontally, I did that red one, and there's only one for the red, did that vertically. Now I'm going to glue this to the base of the card, once again using that same Barely Art glue, making that it fits right on that base. So the outside of that particular die cut is the size of a card, so it's 4¼ by 5½ inches. I'm going to set that aside for that glue to dry while I assemble my little mailbox here. And I have them die cut already to go in one of my craft stacks. I use these all the time when I'm creating. I don't know what I ever did without them. They come in so handy, and every project I do now, I have the craft stacks just sitting there ready to go. Keeps everything nice and organized, and I can make sure that I'm not losing any die cuts or misplacing anything because of those edges there. So once I have my mailbox ready to go here, I can glue that onto my card. The stitching die of the month has several different sentiments that fit into a little tab die here. I chose to use the thank you one. There's several different ones you can pick and choose, and obviously you can pick and choose what color cardstock you do it in. Then I glued my mailbox down, and here I decided to use one of the solid hot foiled sentiments on there. It just kind of worked with the width of the line of that stitching. I had originally planned on using one of the stamps on the front, but I thought this worked a little bit better. So I ended up choosing to use one of the stamps on the inside as well, or instead, and it worked good with the sentiments that I had on the front there. So anytime I'm using my clear stamps for the first time, I always take a white eraser. I rub it against the stamping surface to remove any possible manufacturing residue, and then I use a soft brush to remove any eraser bits. This makes sure that I get a nice clear stamping, and I only have to do that one time, but it tends to make that ink stick a little bit better to the stamp and less resistant to inks, especially dye-based inks. I put that in my MISTI stamping tool and that helped me stamp it a couple times to get a nice clear stamping. And then I just used a damp cloth to get that distress ink off my stamp. When I'm using dye inks, I typically don't use any special cleaners or anything, just a damp cloth just to rub that ink off. For my next card, I'm using the BetterPress of the month, so I have my BetterPress system out. I love the fact that the outside postage lines for this particular BetterPress plate is separate from those inside script bits, so you can adjust where those script pieces go, and it also has enough room to put one of the sentiments in there. So I laid everything out on my BetterPress, and I'm just using the Candied Apple Distress ink. I'm pressing it onto some pale blue cardstock for something just a little bit different. This one is a Spellbinders one. It's one of the new ones. It's called Windy. It's just a really nice pale blue, and it worked well with the other blues that I chose. Put my clear plate onto the base of the BetterPress and ran it through my Platinum 6 machine to press those plates into that cardstock. So the cardstock I used there was 4¼ by 5½ inches. And with that pressed down, I'm just using my trimmer to trim it down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. And it fits perfectly with the outside postage of that BetterPress image. So with that red ink on that blue cardstock, I thought poppy cardstock would be the perfect mat for it. So I trimmed that down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And we're ready to add that to my card base. Once again, using that Best Ever Craft glue. The thing that I love about liquid glues is it gives you that wiggle room. It gives you some shimmy time, but you also tend not to need to use a whole lot of it. So it goes a really long way. Anytime you use tape or tape runners, it tends to not nearly last as long as you feel that it should. And I find with liquid glue, you get a lot more longevity out of it. So I have the pieces for my little snail here already die cut, ready to go. Again, with any of the Spellbinders dies that layer together, they're very easy to put together. When you die cut them, there's a little impression that gets put into them, showing you exactly where the next layer on top goes. So there's very little guesswork to it. Makes it very easy to put them together. And once again, this is another place where that liquid glue comes in handy because it makes it really easy to shimmy and move things in place, especially when it comes to really tiny pieces. I'm using some reverse tweezers here to put some of the tinier die cuts on. This way I can hold them in the tweezers and put a tiny little bit of glue on there. My fingers aren't going to be in the way and I don't get glue on my fingers, but I can see exactly where I want to put it. I love this tiny little hat for the snail. I think it looks absolutely perfect. So for this particular one, there is a tiny little letter here that I have him holding. There's also a larger one that you could use as well. I just really liked the small one. I thought the scale was a lot better. I'm also going to be using this letter for my next card. I have it die cut out of several different colors of cardstock. Again, I just really liked the size of it. For the eyes, I put a little scrap of white cardstock behind it, and then I'm just putting the black pieces of the eyes on the inside. Jewel pickers are very, very handy when it comes to tiny, tiny die cuts as well. It makes it really, really easy to pick them up. Only thing you need to make sure is that they're laying the right side up when you pick them up. So here's the card on its own, but I thought it would look great if he had glossy eyes. So I'm adding a little bit of glossy accents to the eyes as well as his antenna. And then I kind of thought, because it's a snail, why not have a little bit of a slimy or glossy trail behind him? So I added that little trail behind him there and then let that completely dry. And because glossy accents is clear, you don't actually see it until you tilt it into the light. However, keep in mind that if you put it over any of that distress ink, because distress ink is water reactive and it's not a permanent ink, if you have it over any of that, it will blend and bleed. So just know that if you put it over the ink, it's going to start to bleed. For my next card, I have just a piece of Hammermill Cardstock here. I'm going to use the stencil of the month and just use these postage outside bits. I don't really know what it would be called. I'm ink blending them with Candied Apple Distress Ink for the first layer, and then I'm going to be using the next layer with the Weathered Wood Distress Ink just to create an interesting background. There's another layer stencil in this set that creates just a background with a bunch of different envelopes, which is really, really cute as well. I opted not to use it in this video. I just thought this background was better, and for any of the other ideas I had, I thought it would be a little bit too busy. So I don't use it in this video, but there is another background that you can use, and I love the fact that there are a couple to choose from. The layering is very, very easy to do. The image part of the stencil here, you can see exactly where the corners are supposed to go, so it makes it really easy. And when I'm doing my stenciling, I always do it in both clockwise and counterclockwise to make sure that I don't have any ink building up on one side of the stencil. So the piece of cardstock that I used there was 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, so it fits perfectly onto my card base. So I'm going to glue that onto the card base, put my acrylic block on it, and just set that aside while I work on my little mailbox. Now this mailbox, I think it's absolutely adorable, and I thought it would be cute to make it in kind of a shaker box. I don't do a whole lot of dimension for this shaker because I just want to put some of those envelopes that I was talking about from the die of the month, the one that the snail was holding. I have it die cut a couple times, and I thought it would be interesting to do this front little window clear, put some acetate on it, and then show the letters in there and have them be able to be movable and shakeable. So once I have the little piece of acetate on there, I'm just using some strong double-sided tape in order to tape that in place. I stuck that to the side, and then I'm ready to assemble my flowers here. And they are just like the tulips that were from the die of the month, but these are just a much smaller scale, as well as the greenery looks a little bit different. So the greenery looks a little bit more like roses, I would think, but the flowers themselves look a little bit more like tulips. So just like the larger tulips from the die of the month, these have a solid back part of them, and then there's a scooped front petal part of them. So I'm putting the back part down first, and then I'm putting the front part down on top of it. Because these flowers were so much smaller than the ones from the die of the month, I didn't bother to do any ink blending with them, but you certainly could if you wanted to add that visual dimension. I kind of figured with the post box, with the little letters that create the shaker box, there was going to be enough color and enough going on that I didn't really think it was totally necessary. And these die cuts, they're a little bit big, or a little bit bigger than the tiny centers of the eye, so I don't need to use my jewel picker for them. However, my two fingers do kind of get in the way, but this is where using liquid glue comes in handy, because you can shimmy and move it. Even if you don't get it placed perfectly, you can move it exactly where you want it to go. So I did a couple of them on screen and then did the rest of them off screen. The front flap, or the top door for this mailbox, is separate, so I have it die cut out of a different color cardstock. The base of it is done with Celestial cardstock, and then that darker blue color, that navy blue color, is indigo. I have some of the larger letters from this die set die cut to just put into the opening of that mailbox. I didn't want it to be open on its own, so by shoving those letters in there, putting those letters in there, it fills up that space. I glued them to the bottom part first, and then once they were all glued in place, I just added a little bit of glue behind them just to secure them. Then I have some foam tape strips here. I'm just using this to create that dimension for the shaker. Again, this is not really thick foam, so it doesn't create a ton of dimension to it. I could easily have layered it on top of each other if I wanted to add more dimension, but I just wanted enough just for those letters to have room to move to create that shaker. Again, if you want it to be dimensional or even more dimensional, you can layer those on top of each other. So before taking that backing off that tape, I'm just going to make sure that where I put it, I know exactly where I want to put it and that it's going to look proper there. I take the backing off of that tape. I'm going to take those tiny little postcard letters and put them where that opening, or where that window for the mailbox is, before adding the mailbox to the base of my card. So when I stacked those letter or postage die cuts in there, I put them up a little bit too high, so they were kind of jammed in there, didn't really want to move. So I lifted up the one corner, used my die pick to separate them a little bit. When I was putting them there, I was concerned I didn't want them to get stuck underneath my foam tape, and I wanted to make sure that they weren't taped in place, basically. And by doing this, it just made it so that they could move a little bit more freer. If by chance you wanted to do this and wanted to avoid this step, another option would be to die cut the post box out of just some white cardstock and stick that to the back and make a separate element, and then glue it to the front of the card. It worked out totally fine, but just know that if you stack them on top of each other and you don't have a lot of foam tape dimension, there is a chance that they will stick in place and you'll have to do the same thing to fix it. An easy thing to fix, but I just wanted to explain exactly what it was that I was doing. So with my post box all ready to go, I can glue on my little flowers here. I didn't want to cover too much of that window. I wanted to make sure that that was visible. So I just put them to both the right and to the left there. Then just trimmed off these stems to the bottom. I wanted to make sure that they were just even with that bottom of the post box. And then the little lock that I created for this one here, it is just die cut out of some matte silver cardstock, just so that it had some metallic or it was metallic. For the actual die design, it's intended to go where I put the acetate, or that's where they put it. I thought it looked nice on the top as well, so I put it there instead. Took one of the clear stamp sentiments and stamped it on the inside of the card. I didn't want to add it to the front of the card. I thought it was busy enough and I didn't want to clutter it up too much. The nice thing about the clear stamp of the month is you can also get dies to go with them. So if you wanted to, you could stamp them and die cut them and add the sentiment die cut to the front. But again, I wanted to put it on the inside of the card. For the next card here, I'm using the 3D embossing folder of the month. This one's the Postage Mosaic one. I think this one would be a great background all on its own and nice and interesting, but I wanted to create some embellishments for the front of a card. So I have a piece of 8.5 by 5.5 inch Hammermill cardstock. I'm using some Chip Sapphire Distress ink, and I'm going to do that blackout technique, but without black. I'm using the Chip Sapphire because it works better with the color combinations that I have for these cards. I'm using the stacking in my Platinum 6 machine for embossing with a 3D embossing folder, and then I am running it through my machine. Now I use that Best Ever craft tape to tape that cardstock in place because I know that I want to do this multiple times to build that ink up. Typically when I do this technique, 3 times seems to be about the sweet spot, the perfect amount. Sometimes I might need to do it a 4th time, but that seems to be, 3 seems to be about where I generally finish off. So I just repeat that same process, tapping or rubbing the ink on the embossing folder, closing it and putting it back through that machine. And because that piece of cardstock is taped in place, I don't have to worry about it moving in any way. You just want to make sure that when you do tape it in place, that it's in an area that you don't necessarily want or you don't want ink in, because obviously there's not going to be ink on that area. It's not going to be anything that you can use unless you manually put ink on there afterwards. So with my background done here, I'm just going to use some detailed ink blending brushes and color the postage stamps that I want to use. Even just as it is, just with that Chip Sapphire and the white, I think that would be even an interesting background as well. Again, that's not how I want to use it. I wanted to use it a little bit different. So I wanted to add a little bit of color to the images. I didn't want them to be stark white. So by using some detailed ink blending brushes, I can control exactly where that ink goes. I can start where I want the ink to be darkest and either flick or turn it in a circular motion to adjust or to ink blend on those raised surfaces. Because I use Chip Sapphire on the back, it's fairly dark color. So if I get a little bit of this onto that background, it's not going to be super noticeable. Some of the darker colors obviously would be a lot more noticeable than lighter colors, like when I go to use the scattered straw, because it's such a light color, you'd barely be able to see it. But say if I got a little bit of that red on the blue, you might see it a little bit more. By using those detailed ink blending brushes, I have a lot more control. I can control, or I can prevent as much of that ink going onto that back as possible. I left the outside edges of these postage stamps white. I thought they created a nice frame around them. And once I have them ink blended, I'm going to use my shears just to cut around the ones that I want to use. I have 4 different ones here that I've chosen that I want to use for the front of my card. And because of the rule of odd numbers just looking a little bit more visually attractive, I'm going to use my other wax seal for the 5th one. So with them ready to go, I'm just going to take my shears and I'm just doing straight lines around the outside of the postage. You could, if you want, try to be more precise and do the little indent parts. I kind of thought that it wouldn't be as pristine as just doing straight lines. I thought straight lines would just look a little bit nicer. So I opted for that, as well as the fact that it's not nearly as fussy cutting the straight lines than it is cutting some or cutting the little indents or whatnot. If you had a hole punch, you might be able to do it that way as well, but I didn't have one that was the right size that I wanted to try that with. So once I have these ready to go cut out, I'm just going to tuck them to the side. For the background of my card, I'm going to be using the embossing folder of the month, the perforated stamp edges, and I thought those would tie in well with these stamped embellishments. So I have a piece of alabaster cardstock here that I'm just lining up in my embossing folder. I just want to make sure when I do that embossing that it's embossed straight. And my piece of cardstock here is 4¼ by 5½ inches. So once I'm done embossing it, I will use my trimmer to trim it down. I typically like trimming down embossed pieces after they are embossed, just in case it distorts the size in any way. The stacking I used on my machine was for a 2D embossing folder. I didn't use the 3D stacking. It's too loose for this particular folder. And then I wanted just a touch of color on that background behind where I'm putting those stamps. So I just added a little tiny bit of that weathered wood distress ink with a large Spellbinders ink blending brush. It just adds just a touch of color just to tie them all in together. Again, I didn't want anything in the back to distract anything, just a little kiss. So with those pieces ready, I'm ready to start assembling my card. So I have a piece of poppy cardstock here, trimmed to 4 1/8 inches by 5 3/8 inches. Glue that to my card base, and now I can glue down my embossed background here. And anytime I'm using embossed cardstock, I do make sure to be a little bit more generous with my adhesive. I want to make sure that any of those recessed areas have contact with the surface below and make sure that it glues together nice and firmly. Because I've already figured out exactly how I wanted my pieces laid out together, I know where to put them on my card front, and I can just add that glue and position them. There may be slight adjustments to exactly where each one of those pieces goes, but I have an idea where I want each one of them. So I can glue them and put them in place and not worry about not liking the finished look, because I know exactly what it's going to look like. So after I have all of my pieces in place here that are the embossed cardstock, then I'm going to glue down the wax seal. I glue mine down with my Best Ever or Barely Art glue. I find it glues them down just fine. It does take a little bit longer to dry because the wax is a non-porous surface, but I haven't had a problem with gluing them down that way. For the sentiment, I'm using the clear stamp of the month. There's just a really tiny thank you sentiment that I thought would be perfect in the center of that cluster of stamps. And I stamped it onto a white scrap piece of cardstock with that candied apple. It's just going to tie that red in a little bit more. There's a coordinating die to go with it, so I'm going to tape that in place and die cut that. I always love when sentiment stamps have coordinating dies to go with them. It just gives a much nicer finished off look than fussy cutting. Funny, I used to do fussy cutting a lot, and I really liked doing it before dies were a thing, and now I just can't handle it. I don't like the look of it now because dies have really spoiled that for us. So here is the finished result. We have a cluster of those embossed stamps, and they have just some great texture to them. It coordinates well with that wax seal, with that texture, and then that little thank you sentiment in the center just kind of ties it all in together. Then we have our postage box shaker. And it's just a fun way to add a little bit of movement, a little bit of something unexpected to your cards. Obviously, you don't have to create this as a shaker. It's just something I wanted to do. I thought it would make it look a little bit interesting. Then we have our card with that BetterPress background. I think this BetterPress would look, or this plate would look great foiled as well and create a fun foiled background as well with that snail. I think it's adorable. Then we have our stitched background with our Mailbox die cut, as well as our solid hot foiled sentiment from the Glimmer of the month. Then we have our solid hot foiled background. That background with those letters look fantastic with those bright tulips on the front of it, plus the sentiment and that wax seal. And then our first card there, that is the regular foiled wax or regular foiled Glimmer of the month, using the caboodle item to color those in there. So I have 6 cards here that were created with the clubs this month. I typically don't do all of my clubs in one video. I wanted to, I just had so many ideas to share. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.